In the summer of 1914, Europe marched to war with confidence. Political leaders predicted a short conflict. Soldiers were told they would be home by Christmas. Generals believed bold offensives would shatter the enemy in a matter of weeks. Instead, the war lasted more than 4 years. By late 1914, the armies of Europe were locked in a grinding stalemate stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Casualties mounted into the millions. Gains were measured not in miles, but in yards. World War I did not begin as a war of attrition. It became one. Today, we examine why. Not because generals were foolish, not because leaders lacked courage, but because strategy, technology, and industrial power collided in ways no one fully understood. Europe's pre-war assumptions. Before 1914, European military doctrine was shaped by the wars of the 19th century, especially the victories of the German Empire in 1866 and 1870-71. In the Franco-Prussian War, rapid mobilization, railroads, and decisive battles crushed France in months. That war became the model. The lesson drawn was simple. Speed wins. Offensive spirit wins. Decisive battle ends wars quickly. Across Europe, general staffs built war plans designed for rapid knockouts. France developed Plan 17, emphasizing aggressive assaults to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. Germany developed the Schlieffen Plan, aiming to defeat France swiftly before turning east against Russia. Russia relied on mass mobilization. Austria-Hungary counted on speed to contain Serbia. All assumed movement. None anticipated paralysis. The opening campaigns of 1914. When war began in August 1914, movement dominated. German armies surged through Belgium. French forces advanced toward the German frontier. Russian armies invaded East Prussia. Austro-Hungarian forces attacked Serbia. The first month was fluid and violent, but then came a turning point. In September 1914, at the First Battle of the Marne, French and British forces halted the German advance just outside Paris. The German right wing faltered. Supply lines stretched thin. Troops were exhausted. The opportunity for decisive victory vanished. What followed was not retreat, but entrenchment. Both sides attempted to outflank one another in what became known as the Race to the Sea. Each time one army moved north to turn the other's flank, the opponent extended as well. Within weeks, continuous trench lines ran across northern France and Belgium. Movement ended. Stalemate began. The defensive revolution. Why did the front freeze? Because by 1914, defensive technology had become overwhelmingly powerful. The machine gun, perfected in the late 19th century, transformed the battlefield. A small team could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Defensive positions multiplied its effectiveness. Barbed wire slowed attackers, breaking up formations and exposing soldiers to fire. Most devastating of all was modern artillery. By 1914, artillery had become the dominant killer on the battlefield. Heavy guns could fire shells miles away with lethal precision. High-explosive shells shredded infantry, destroyed fortifications, and cratered landscapes. The battlefield became an environment of industrial destruction. Attacking infantry had to cross open ground under machine gun fire, rifle volleys, shrapnel, high-explosive artillery. Even well-trained troops suffered catastrophic losses. This was not because generals were ignorant. It was because offensive doctrine had not yet adapted to defensive firepower. Military planners understood artillery's power, but believed morale, speed, and mass could overcome it. They were wrong. The illusion of the offensive. In the early months of war, both sides launched repeated offensives. The French attacks in Alsace-Lorraine, the British assault at Neuve-Chapelle, the German push toward Ypres. Each time, the pattern repeated. Initial bombardment, infantry advance, heavy casualties, minimal territorial gain. The problem was coordination. Communications relied on runners, signal flags, primitive telephones, and carrier pigeons. Once battle began, control disintegrated. Artillery barges often lifted too early or too late. Infantry moved slower than planned across cratered terrain. Defenders, protected by trenches and reinforced positions, survived bombardments and returned to their machine guns. The cost was staggering. Yet offensives continued. Why? because politically and psychologically, leaders believed they had no alternative. A defensive strategy ceded initiative. It risked morale collapse. It conceded territory. And so commanders kept attacking. Industrial mobilization changes everything. Unlike previous wars, this conflict drew upon entire national economies. Factories converted to shell production. Railways transported millions of troops. Steel production surged. Chemical industries developed new explosives. The war became industrialized at a scale Europe had never seen. The British Empire mobilized resources from across its colonies. The Russian Empire fielded enormous manpower reserves. The German army leveraged efficient rail mobilization and industrial coordination. Because industrial states could replace losses, offensives did not end the war. They prolonged it. When tens of thousands died in a single week, governments did not sue for peace. They drafted more soldiers. They produced more shells. They prepared the next attack. Attrition became possible only because industry made it sustainable. Geography and logistics. The Western Front also favored offense geographically. Northern France and Belgium were crisscrossed by rivers, villages, rail lines, and industrial towns. This terrain supported defensive depth. Trenches evolved into complex systems. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve lines, dugouts reinforced with timber and concrete, interlocking fields of fire. Breaking through one line did not collapse the defense. It revealed another. Even when attackers succeeded locally, they lacked mechanized mobility to exploit breakthroughs. There were no tanks in 1914. Motor transport was limited. Cavalry proved ineffective against machine guns. The result? Operational success rarely became strategic victory. The Eastern contrast. Interestingly, the Eastern Front remained more fluid. Vast distances and less developed rail networks prevented continuous trench systems like those in France. But even there, attrition dominated. At battles like Battle of Tannenberg, entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Casualties remained immense. The difference was space, not lethality. Modern firepower still ruled. Why the war did not end in 1914. By December 1914, it was clear quick victory was impossible. Defensive firepower was dominant. Industrial production could sustain massive losses. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. The war had transformed. It was no longer a contest of maneuver. It had become a contest of endurance. Who could endure longer? Who could replace losses? Who could produce more shells? Who could maintain morale? The war movement had become a war of attrition. And yet, commanders did not simply accept stalemate. They sought solutions. Massive artillery barges, new tactics, new weapons, new strategies. The battles that locked Europe into attrition. In late 1914, the war had stalled. But stalemate was not accepted as permanent. Commanders on both sides believed that with enough force, enough artillery, enough coordination, enough sacrifice, the deadlock could be broken. Instead, the opposite happened. The very attempts to restore maneuver warfare hardened the logic of attrition. Verdun, bleeding France white. In 1916, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn proposed a new strategy. He did not believe Germany could achieve a sweeping breakthrough on the Western Front. Instead, he argued that France could be worn down to collapse. His target was Verdun. The Battle of Verdun began in February 1916. Verdun was chosen not merely for tactical value, but for symbolic importance. It was a fortress complex deeply tied to French national pride. Falkenhayn's concept was not territorial conquest. It was attrition by design. German artillery opened with one of the most intense bombardments yet seen. Millions of shells fell on French positions. Entire hillsides were obliterated. The goal was simple: force France to defend Verdun at all costs. Inflict disproportionate casualties. Exhaust the French army. But the plan miscalculated something crucial. France did defend Verdun at all costs. Under commanders like Philippe Pétain, the French instituted a constant rotation system, moving divisions in and out to prevent total collapse. Supply lines along the Voie Sacrée kept reinforcements flowing. The battle became a furnace. By the end of 1916, casualties on both sides approached 700,000. Verdun did not break France. It bled both armies. Attrition, once a strategy aimed at one side, became mutual destruction. The Somme, industrial slaughter. If Verdun symbolized deliberate attrition, the Battle of the Somme symbolized the industrial scale of it. Launched in July 1916 by British and French forces, the Somme was originally intended to relieve pressure on Verdun. The plan seemed logical. A massive artillery barrage would destroy German defenses. Infantry would advance behind creeping fire. Breakthrough would follow. The artillery preparation lasted a week. Over 1.5 million shells were fired. Yet when British troops advanced on July 1st, they encountered intact barbed wire and surviving machine gun nests. The first day became the bloodiest in British military history. Over 57,000 casualties. But the offensive did not stop. It continued for months. Why? Because industrial war created a grim arithmetic. If enough shells were fired, if enough attacks were launched, if enough pressure was applied, eventually the enemy would weaken. The Somme introduced new elements, most notably the first battlefield use of tanks in September 1916. These early machines were unreliable and few in number. They did not restore mobility. Instead, they became another incremental adaptation in a war dominated by firepower. By November, the Allies had advanced roughly 6 miles. Casualties exceeded 1 million combined. The Somme did not break Germany. It expanded the scale of attrition. Artillery becomes the master weapon. By 1916, artillery was responsible for the majority of battlefield deaths. Industrial economies allowed for unprecedented shell production. The British Army and the German Army developed increasingly sophisticated methods. Creeping barges, counter-battery fire, heavy siege guns, improved fuses and high explosives. But artillery had limits. Bombardments churned landscapes into mud and craters. Communication lines were destroyed. Terrain became impassable. Even when defenses were smashed, attackers struggled to move forward quickly enough before defenders reorganized. Thus artillery, though dominant, reinforced stalemate. It killed efficiently. It did not deliver decision. Defensive depth and tactical adaptation. As offensives intensified, defenders adapted. Germany in particular developed elastic defense in depth tactics. Instead of rigidly holding every trench, they created layered defensive zones, lightly held forward lines, reinforced second positions, counterattack units positioned in reserve. This system absorbed initial assaults and launched counterblows against exhausted attackers. In 1917, Germany formalized these tactics along the Hindenburg Line, named after Paul von Hindenburg. Concrete bunkers, deep dugouts, and carefully arranged fields of fire made the line formidable. The lesson was clear. Defense was learning faster than offense. Each failed breakthrough taught defenders how to resist the next one. Attrition deepened. Total war in the home front. Attrition was not confined to the battlefield. It extended to economies and civilians. Britain used naval supremacy to impose a blockade on Germany. The blockade restricted food and raw materials, gradually weakening German industry and civilian morale. Germany responded with unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting shipping in the Atlantic. The war expanded globally. Colonial troops fought in Europe. Resources flowed from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Financial systems strained under war loans and inflation. Industrial capacity became as important as tactical success. Victory increasingly depended on steel production, coal output, ammunition supply, transportation efficiency. The war had become a test of national endurance. Why leaders continued offensive strategy? A common narrative claims generals were stubborn or indifferent to casualties. The historical record is more complex. Commanders understood losses were immense, but they faced constraints. Political pressure, governments demanded action. A purely defensive posture risked loss of public support. Alliance obligations, coordinated offensives were necessary to prevent allies from collapsing. Fear of enemy breakthrough. Waiting invited the possibility of decisive defeat. Lack of alternatives. Technology had not yet matured to enable rapid maneuver under fire. Within these constraints, offensive action appeared rational, even if outcomes were devastating. Attrition was not chosen casually. It emerged from strategic necessity under industrial conditions, the psychological dimension. By 1916, the war's psychology shifted. Initial enthusiasm faded. Armies endured prolonged exposure to shell fire, trench conditions, and constant threat. Yet morale did not collapse uniformly. Why? Because both sides believed endurance would ultimately bring victory. Germany hoped Britain and France would exhaust themselves. The Allies believed their greater industrial resources would prevail. The logic of attrition depended on faith and endurance. And for years, both sides possessed enough strength to continue. The war expands. In 1917, two major developments altered the balance. The entry of the United States into the war added immense industrial and manpower resources to the Allied side. At the same time, revolution engulfed the Russian Empire, leading to its withdrawal from the war. The global scale intensified. Yet even these shifts did not immediately restore maneuver. Attrition still dominated. By 1917, the war had consumed millions of lives. Verdun and the Somme demonstrated that massive offensives produced staggering casualties with limited territorial gain. Artillery ruled the battlefield. Defense adapted continuously. Industry sustained losses. World War I had fully transformed into a war of attrition, not by accident, but through strategic logic shaped by technology and industrial power. How attrition finally broke the stalemate. By 1917, Europe was exhausted. Millions were dead. Economies were strained. Civilian populations were hungry. Armies were hardened, but diminished. For 3 years, the Western Front had consumed men and material at industrial scale. Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, each offensive promised breakthrough. Each delivered attrition. Yet in 1918, the stalemate finally ended. Not because trench warfare suddenly became obsolete, not because generals abandoned caution, and not because technology alone transformed the battlefield. The breakthrough came because attrition had done its work. Germany's last gamble, the Spring Offensive, with Russia out of the war after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany could transfer divisions from the Eastern Front to the West. For the first time since 1914, it possessed temporary numerical superiority. Under the leadership of Erich Ludendorff, Germany launched a massive series of offensives in the spring of 1918. Collectively known as the Spring Offensive, these attacks aimed to break the stalemate before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. This was not a return to 1914-style maneuver. German planners had learned from years of attrition. They developed new infiltration tactics, specialized stormtrooper units, short, intense artillery bombardments, bypassing strong points rather than frontal assault, rapid penetration into rear areas. For a brief moment, mobility returned. German forces advanced farther in weeks than in years. Allied lines bent under pressure. Paris once again seemed threatened, but the offensive carried a fatal weakness. Germany lacked reserves to sustain success. Supply lines lagged behind advancing troops. Artillery could not keep pace. Exhausted soldiers outran logistics. Attrition had already hollowed the German army. The Spring Offensive achieved tactical gains, but not strategic decision. And when momentum slowed, Germany had no fresh strength left. The industrial weight of the Allies. While Germany gambled everything, the Allies had something new: time and industry. The entry of the United States in 1917 did not immediately change the battlefield. American troops required training and transport, but by mid-1918, their presence was decisive. Hundreds of thousands of fresh soldiers arrived monthly. American industrial production added ships, trucks, artillery, and supplies to Allied capacity. Attrition had become asymmetric. Germany was exhausted. The Allies were reinforced. When the German offensive stalled in July 1918, the strategic balance had shifted permanently. The Allied counteroffensive, the 100 Days. In August 1918, the Allies launched what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. This campaign was not one massive assault, but a coordinated series of blows. At the Battle of Amiens, British, French, Canadian, Australian, and American forces attacked with a new combination of tanks in large numbers, coordinated artillery barges, close air support, improved infantry tactics. Unlike earlier years, these offensives did not pause after limited gains. They were continuous. German defensive systems, already weakened by years of attrition, began to crack. For the first time since 1914, large-scale retreat replaced stalemate. Why now? Because attrition had finally reached a tipping point. Germany no longer possessed the manpower, industrial capacity, or morale to absorb losses and recover. The same defensive systems that once seemed unbreakable were now undermanned and undersupplied. The war of endurance had been decided. Technology matures. Another key factor in 1918 was the maturation of technology. In 1916, tanks were experimental and unreliable. By 1918, they were more numerous and better integrated into battle plans. Aircraft evolved from reconnaissance tools into instruments of coordination and ground attack. Artillery techniques improved dramatically. Predicted fire reduced the need for lengthy registration. Creeping barges became more precise. Counter-battery methods suppressed enemy guns more effectively. None of these innovations alone broke the stalemate, but combined with weakened German forces, they enabled sustained offensive movement. Attrition had created the conditions under which new tactics could succeed. Collapse on the home front. Attrition was never purely military. Germany's civilian population had suffered under years of blockade imposed by the British Empire. Food shortages intensified. Industrial output declined. Public morale deteriorated. By late 1918, strikes and unrest spread through German cities. In October and November, naval mutinies and political upheaval triggered revolution. The German High Command understood the reality. The army could no longer continue. On November 11, 1918, the armistice ended the fighting, not because one final battle shattered the front, but because years of attrition had made continuation impossible. Why World War I became attritional? Looking back, the transformation of World War I into a war of attrition was not inevitable, but it was highly probable given the conditions of 1914. Several structural factors drove the outcome. Defensive firepower dominance. Machine guns, artillery, and trenches favored defense over offense. Industrial capacity. Modern economies could sustain enormous losses. Rail mobilization. Rapid concentration of troops prevented decisive encirclements. Political commitments. Total war meant no easy exit without victory. Technological lag. Mechanized mobility had not yet caught up with firepower. These factors combined to produce prolonged stalemate. Attrition was not simply a choice. It was a result of modern industrial states fighting with technologies that favored killing more than maneuvering. Beyond the Western Front, while the Western Front defines the image of attrition, similar dynamics unfolded elsewhere. On the Italian front, repeated offensives along the Isonzo River consumed hundreds of thousands of casualties. In the Middle East, campaigns were more fluid, but still shaped by logistics and industrial supply. At sea, submarine warfare became another form of attrition, targeting economic lifelines rather than trench lines. World War I was a global contest of endurance. The strategic legacy. The war's attritional nature left a profound legacy. Military thinkers studied its lessons intensely between the wars. Some concluded that future wars must avoid static slaughter through mechanization and maneuver. Others focus on air power as a means to bypass trenches entirely. The interwar period saw efforts to solve the problem World War I exposed. How do you restore mobility in an age of industrial firepower? The answer would emerge imperfectly in the next global conflict. But in 1914 to 1918, the answer did not yet exist. Closing reflection. World War I did not begin as a war of attrition. It became one because technology favored defense. Industry enabled prolonged fighting. Politics demanded victory. And neither side could deliver decisive maneuver under modern firepower. The generals were not blind to the slaughter. They were operated within constraints imposed by industrial modernity. Attrition was not a failure of imagination alone. It was the logic of the age. And only when that logic exhausted one side completely did movement return. If you found this analysis valuable, Consider subscribing to Recorded Conflicts for more structured, evidence-based war history.